Hi again, it's me. I'm going to try and do quite a few videos while I'm in school today, and I'm uninterrupted. So the next video I'm going to do is the AO1, the LO12, which is the cognitive approach to treating depression, looking specifically at CBT. So you should have done your retrieval grid exercise on slide 1, which is basically just recalling all of the information from LO10 and 11. Both AO1 and AO3. So it's looking at the negative triad AO1, what can you remember about that? Ellis's ABC model of depression, what can you remember about that? And then finally, just as many AO3 points as you can for that whole approach to explaining depression. Now we're moving on to LO12, which is the use of cognitive behaviour therapy as a way of treating depression. So basically, some background information on what CBT is. Before we look at the two particular types of CBT that can be used to treat depression. Now, you will have heard me mention in the previous video that CBT is one of our most powerful therapies within psychology today. And the reason it's so powerful, it's very diverse in its application. Now, what that means, it can be used to treat a number of different illnesses and problems. So it could be used for anger management, it's used in prisons, it can be used for addiction, eating disorders, it goes on and on and on. CBT is incredibly powerful because it's diverse in its application. So psychologists that we've already looked at, Ellis and Beck, have developed CBT to treat patients with depression, and we're going to look at specifically how they've done that. But before we start, just a bit of background on what CBT is. It's called cognitive behaviour therapy, and that's because there are two parts to it really. There's the first phase, which is the cognitive element, and then you move on to the behavioural element. In the cognitive element, the client and the therapist work together to uncover what thought processes and belief systems are at the cause of the problem. So remember, if we're using cognitive behavioural therapy, we tend to assume that the reason the person has the problem is because some of their cognitive processes are faulty or irrational. So the therapist's job really is to help the client understand that the way they're thinking about whatever it is not accurate, it's wrong, it's not realistic. And the way they do that is really through an interview. The therapist is much more a facilitator. They guide the client to come to their own conclusion. So they ask lots of questions and the client answers. The client is a lot more, not necessarily the client in control, it's more collaborative. So it's both the therapist and the client working together in order to help the patient recover. Once they begin to identify the cognitive thought processes and the irrational beliefs, the next step is to give the client behavioural tasks that will help them understand that the way they're thinking is wrong. So role play exercises, homework assignments, individual tasks that the client would usually do in between sessions, and then they bring the outcome of those tasks back to the follow-up session. The last bit of CBT that's really useful to know is that the client is often taught lots of practical skills and strategies that they can use in the real world once the therapy is over. So once the treatment is concluded, the client can then use a lot of the techniques, the breathing exercises, the counting, the meditation, the imagery, lots of techniques that the therapist will have taught them in the real world to help them cope with the problem once the therapist is no longer there. That's another reason why it's so powerful, because it gives the client coping mechanisms and coping strategies. So that's what CBT is in general. On your slide you've got just a couple of sentences. Feel free to copy them out or add some more detail from what I've said about there being two parts, cognitive and behavioural, and what they entail. But then underneath that you've got two types of CBT that have been specifically designed for depression, and both of them come from the two approaches to explaining depression. So you've got Beck, who developed the negative triad. He then put a cognitive therapy together that would help sort of deal with depression based on the negative triad, and Ellis did the same with his ABC model. Ellis's ABC model led to a treatment called REBT, which is rational emotive behavioural therapy, that can be used to treat depression. If I'm going to start explaining Beck's cognitive therapy, it's very, very simple. They basically, in that first cognitive part of CBT, Beck would help the client understand what their irrational thoughts were about the world, themselves and the future, because according to Beck, they were the three sources of negative thinking that led to depression in the first place. So they would have to help the client uncover what those cognitive thoughts are. Then they would give them behavioural tasks to help dispute or challenge those irrational beliefs and thoughts. So the negative view about the self that was uncovered in the therapy was that nobody liked them. Okay, so the client had the faulty belief about themselves that was negative, that nobody in the world liked them. The client then might set them a task to do in between the 2 sessions, which would involve every time somebody did something with that person to document it. So every time they text them, every time they rang them up, every time they had a conversation with them, any time they paid them a compliment or did spent any time with them or visited them, the client would then have to write all that down. They would bring that information to the therapist session, the following therapist session. And what they would, the client then has all of that information. The therapist presents it back as evidence to prove that belief that they had uncovered in the previous session was faulty. So you said nobody liked you. However, here are 10 examples from the previous week where people have called you, where people have spent time with you, where people have paid you a compliment. How can all of that happen if your belief was accurate? And then the therapist and the client work together to work through all of these different thought processes about the world themselves and the future to challenge and prove. Basically, reality test is a nice phrase to use here, to reality test those belief systems and prove that some of those belief systems are not real, and that the client begins to come to their own conclusions that they're thinking is faulty. The second type of CBT that we have to treat depression is Ellis's REBT, which stands for Rational Emotive Behavioural Therapy. Basically, he extended his ABC model to the ABCDEF model. If A is the activating event, B is the beliefs about what caused the activating event, and C is the consequences of those beliefs, D is disputing those beliefs. Okay, so you said you failed your psychology exam, which was our activating event, because you believe you are no good at psychology and you can't do it. That has led to you not working very hard in psychology, the consequences of it, and you're considering dropping out. Okay, I'm going to dispute your irrational beliefs. Why do you think you're no good at psychology? Talk to me about all the times your teacher has given you positive feedback, or any time you've done an exam question you've got some good marks, or let's have a look at the work that you've produced so far. And you again provide evidence to dispute that irrational belief. Then what happens, it leads to effects. So, okay, I've realised maybe I'm not as bad as psychology as I thought, so I'm going to start trying harder. I'm going to start applying myself a little bit better. That then leads to, me being more successful, and the teacher giving me more feedback and praise and encouragement, and it just becomes self-perpetuating. And then that leads to F, which is the feelings, which is basically they feel happier and feel more positive. So A is the activating event, B is the beliefs about the activating event, C is the consequences of those beliefs, but by disputing those irrational beliefs, that will lead to different effects or consequences, and then better feelings, happier feelings, which will basically make the client feel happier. I want you to put self-perpetuating in your vocabulary books. I'm going to get you a definition now. Self-perpetuating, it's basically something that continues without external agency. Something that continues without external agency. What that basically means is something that continues on its own with no one needing to make it happen. So if something's self-perpetuating, it'll just keep going and going and going on its own, and it won't need an external agency or anyone else or anything else to make it happen. It'll just self-perpetuate. So that's a nice tier 2 vocabulary. So add that to your vocabulary book and highlight that in green, please. Going back to Ellis's ABC model, something that he said was very important for his CBT to be effective is unconditional positive regard. Now basically Ellis believed that this is essential for any therapy to work. Unconditional positive regard is basically where the therapist has no judgment on the client whatsoever. So if the client said something that's really bizarre and irrational, and you'd be thinking, why are you thinking that? The therapist would not display that to the client. The client has to feel that they are accepted by the therapist unconditionally. So there isn't actually a definition of unconditional positive regard on the PowerPoint, so I'm just going to get you on as well. This would be tier 3, and you can put this in your in your vocabulary books. It's the acceptance and support of a person regardless of what they say or do. So unconditional positive regard is the acceptance or support from a person regardless of what they say or do. So no matter what the client says or does, the therapist, according to Ellis, has to provide unconditional positive regard and fully accept them, and they will and that's essential for the therapy to work. If the client feels that the therapist is making any judgments or looking at them negatively, then it won't work. Okay, so that's essential. Something else that CBT, I know we can leave that bit out. There's a bullet point there on behavioural activations, quite simple and straightforward. You can add that in if you want. So you've listened to the video. Now I've explained all the AO1. Hopefully you've made notes and had it in front of you. What I would like you to do is to write it up into your book under the LO12 title, and then complete the assessment task on Show My Homework, which is to outline the cognitive approach to treating depression, which is CBT, of which CBT, you've got two types. You've got Beck's Cognitive Therapy and you've got Ellis' REBT. Brilliant. Thank you.